So trade is a controversial topic. I make it sound like, wow, who would be against this thing called trade? It creates value, it makes us rich. Who would be against trade? Well, even in Adam Smith's day, there were people who didn't like trade. In his day, there were people that especially didn't like trading with the French. The British had been fighting wars on and off again for centuries with the French. This crazy Scotsman, Adam Smith, with his funny accent, he says, hey, we should trade with the French. And they're like, what do you mean? No, they're our enemies. And Adam Smith had a very simple argument for it. He talks about it in The Wealth of Nations. He says, why should we trade with the French? It's because their wine is cheap. He mentions that, by means of glasses, hotbeds, and hot walls. I'm not sure what glasses, hotbeds, and hot walls are. I think it's greenhouses or something like that. But by means of certain technologies, you can grow very good grapes in Scotland and make fine wine. But it's going to be 30 times more expensive than French wine. Adam Smith says, what's better? What's better? Wine that's $30 or wine that's $1? $1 wine sounds better than $30 wine. Adam Smith recognized that the French were better at making wine. The climate was better there for growing grapes. You can do it in Scotland, but it's just going to be really, really costly. And so he said we should trade with the French. And of course, what are we going to sell to them? Well, we can sell wool, because in England, it's cold. In Scotland, it's cold. We have sheep, and they get really big fur coats, or wool coats, I guess. Not fur, it's wool, right? And they grow, and we can trade the wool that we're really good at making here in the British Isles, and we'll trade that to the French, okay? So Adam Smith recognized that there are people out there in his era that didn't like trade, and he had to engage them, and we're still doing that today. There are some arguments against trading. Most of these arguments are going to be couched in international trade terms, like why we should or shouldn't trade with China, why we should or shouldn't trade with Mexico, or why we should or shouldn't trade with Cuba or whoever. There are some arguments. The three arguments that you hear the most are national defense, dumping, and the infant industry argument. Let's take each one of these in turn. Now, the national defense argument is the one that I think has the most plausibility. It's the one that I don't disregard entirely. The national defense argument is that, maybe it's not a good idea to trade with North Korea. Like if North Korea calls up a supercomputer company or even Apple and says, hey, would you sell us an Apple computer? And the American government says, we really shouldn't do that. Why? Well, because they're an enemy, right? They have missiles pointed at our allies, South Korea, Japan, and we're worried that maybe they're going to launch those things. We don't want them to have better computers to make those, to do better models and to track their missiles better, design new things, new weapons. We don't want that. The argument for not trading with countries like North Korea is pretty straightforward. But so we have other trade restrictions and sanctions against Russia during the Ukraine war now. We've got Iran, Cuba. Of course, we've had a trade restriction with Cuba for decades now. So there are certain examples in time and place where maybe the government steps in and says, I know you'd like to trade with them, but they're our enemies, and we don't want to make them richer and happier, right? Because they're enemies. Remember, trade makes us rich and happy. Maybe we don't want to do that when it comes to North Korea. Okay. So the argument has some merit. The second argument is called dumping. And dumping is a kind of a technical concept. In essence, what it means is selling something below cost. If you sell something below cost, you're said to be dumping. Suppose you sell something for for $8, but it costs you $10 to make it. So it costs $10 to make it, and you sell it for $8. Now, if you're a business school student, that doesn't sound like a good idea. We don't teach business school students at Cox School of Business to go out into the world and make something for $10 and sell it for $8. That's bad business. So why would countries or companies in those countries do such bad business? Why would they intentionally sell products to American consumers below cost and suffer a loss when they do so? Well, the argument is that, what they're going to do is they're going to sell their products below cost. American consumers are going to go buy their products. All the American companies that make those same products will go out of business because they can't compete with those dumped prices. And then after the American companies are all driven out of business, what happens? We raise the prices. So we got them, okay? That's the argument. I've got a couple problems with the argument. First of all, it's never happened. I don't know of a single example. Now, it's true that when companies come in with imports, American companies sometimes go out of business. You know, we make no television sets in the United States, none whatsoever. No televisions are made in the United States. When I was a child, we had a dozen television companies. They make televisions all over the country, factories and jobs and everything. None of them are made in the United States today. All the imported televisions have done such a good job, and American consumers have bought those televisions from Korea and China and everywhere else, Japan. They don't buy American televisions. The American television companies are all out of business. When are they going to raise prices? Because last time I went on Amazon looking for a television, those prices aren't going up, they're going down. All right? So it's that last part of the logic that I think is the problem. Yes, it's true that countries and companies can come in and, put it in quotes if you want, but dump their products into the American market. It does sometimes drive American companies out of business, but we never seem to see that last part. We never seem to see the prices go up after the fact. And I think the reason is that maybe they weren't dumping at all. Maybe they were just good at their jobs. Maybe it was that specialization in trade that we've already talked about. Maybe South Korea, maybe China, maybe Japan, maybe they're just really good at making televisions, better than we are. And so it's actually a good thing. It's that specialization thing that we talked about earlier. The other argument you hear with respect to dumping is that sometimes governments in other countries will subsidize companies. So you'll hear that the Chinese government is subsidizing a Chinese company, and the American companies can't compete with those subsidies. Now, first of all, the American government subsidizes American companies too. So, you know, all governments all over the world, I'm not in favor of this, but the reality is all governments all over the world subsidize companies. Okay, so the United States is one of them, China is one of them, Mexico is one of them, everybody does it, all right? So it's a little bit rich for American companies to complain about subsidies when they receive them themselves. But the second thing is, I'm not sure it's a bad thing. If the Chinese government wants to tax its citizens to make my televisions cheap, yeah, I'm okay with that. If they want to subsidize my standard of living, I think this is not smart on their part, and they're dumb to do this. I mean, I think the Chinese government shouldn't subsidize my lifestyle, but if they really want to subsidize and make my products cheaper, I'm kind of willing to let them do that. I'm being a little bit flippant, but not totally, because seriously, if the governments of China and Mexico if they want to make things cheap for me, I'm generally in favor of cheap stuff. Like Adam Smith was in favor of cheap wine, I'm in favor of cheap televisions. So the third argument is the infant industry argument. It's the one that's most closely identified with the founding father, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton recognized that in the colonial and the early part of the American Republic, there wasn't a lot of manufacturing in the United States. There was only like one iron foundry at the time of the Revolution in the entire 13 colonies. And that made it hard for us to build, to make cannons and rifles, but also just everyday things like plows and shovels and stoves. So Alexander Hamilton says, you know, what we need to do is we need to protect these infant industries, these baby new industries that we are just getting started in the United States. We need to protect them from foreign competition because there's just no way that our new American foundries are going to compete with the ones in England that have been around for decades or even more than a century. So the idea was just like human babies, we don't let them just compete freely with adults, we protect babies. Well, we should do the same thing with industries. Now, the problem with this argument, I'm not a fan of it at all, but if the problem with the argument is that it doesn't do a good job at all of explaining what we actually do. If you look at the industries in the United States that get protected from foreign competition, it's things like textiles and agriculture, cars, things like that. Now, none of these are new industries. We've had textile mills in the United States for more than 100 years. Cars go back decades. Agriculture is the first industry that the United States ever had. These are not infant industries. These are mature adult industries. They should be, according to Alexander Hamilton, once you're mature, you should be you should be competing freely with the rest of the world. You don't get any more special protections. Now, the industries in the United States that are infants are things like pharmaceuticals and software. Now, they actually get no protection. So if you were a modern day Alexander Hamilton, what you would do is you should advocate for protecting the pharmaceutical industries and maybe the software coders and things like that. And we should not be protecting corn farmers or textile mills. So the argument for infant industry, if it has any merit at all, and I'm not really sure that it does, if it has merit at all, it doesn't do a good job of explaining what we actually do. So Those are the three arguments: national defense, dumping, and infant industry. All three of them have a, let's say, ring of plausibility to them. They're not completely crazy, perhaps. I'm not a big fan of any one of them, but they're not insane. But let's be honest with ourselves. Why do we actually have trade protection? Why can't we freely trade with the rest of the world as much as we might like? Well, the answer is there are special interests in the United States that don't want to let us trade. One example is the sugar industry. In the United States, the sugar industry has lobbied Congress, and they have passed laws called sugar quotas. The sugar quota is a limit on the amount of sugar that can come into the United States. Now, what happens if you reduce the amount of sugar that can be imported? Well, it makes the price of sugar in the United States higher. In a typical year, the price of sugar in the United States is about 2 times what it is in the world. So it's much more expensive in the United States. Now, one of the consequences of that is if you use sugar in your company, if you're a buyer of sugar, that means all of the sugar you buy is going to be twice as expensive as it otherwise would be. So you might look for an alternative. In fact, Coca-Cola found an alternative. In this Coca-Cola bottle, carbonated water, second ingredient, high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup. Not sugar, regular old cane granulated sugar, that's called sucrose. This is fructose. This comes from corn. Why aren't they using sucrose? Because, you know, if you go to Mexico or Indonesia or Congo or any country in the world, you get a Coca-Cola, looks pretty much the same, tastes very similar, and they use sucrose, regular old-fashioned granulated sugar. So America, they use corn syrup. The rest of the world uses regular sugar. Well, the answer is obvious now, right? Because in America, regular sugar is 2 times more expensive than the rest of the world, so America switched to fructose. The rest of the world sticks with the cheap sucrose. So if you've ever wondered why Mexican Coke tastes different than American Coke, it's not because of the American consumers and the palate or the taste buds of American consumers. It's because we made our sugar so expensive. Now, why did we do that? Why do we make sugar so expensive? Well, the answer is sugar farmers. We've got a small group of people in Louisiana mainly, some in Florida. There used to be some in Hawaii, but I think they're mostly out of business. There's actually a few in Texas. There's about 20,000 sugar farms in America. That's it. Employs maybe a few tens of thousands of people. It's a small industry. It's a tiny industry. Well, if you were running a business and there was a law in Congress that would double your price of the thing you sell, if you're a sugar farmer and there's a law in Congress like the sugar quota that will double the price of sugar, are you going to lobby Congress for that law to be passed? You betcha. I'm going to call my congressman. I'm going to create a lobby. I'm going to show up with candy or whatever sugar, what's the sugar you lobby bring to the congressman and the senator's offices? They're going to show up with big candy baskets. Here's some American sugar. It's good stuff. So Congress passes the law because of the lobbying. Now, who are the big losers? Us. All of us who have to buy sugar in our cookies and our cupcakes and our colas. It's costing us American consumers. I've seen estimates that it costs about $100, maybe $200 per consumer a year. A couple $100. Are you going to call Congress to save $200? I know the answer already because I know none of you have called Congress about this. Nobody even knew about this probably. Right? The fact is, no one who's harmed by this bothers to call Congress to exercise their voice or their vote to oppose the sugar quota because it's only a couple $100. It's not really worth my time and effort to do that. But if you're a sugar farmer, it's worth millions of dollars per sugar farmer. So we have sugar quotas and we have other trade restrictions, not really because of national defense or dumping or infant industries. We really have them because domestic industries in the United States, like sugar, have lobbied for those laws to protect themselves from competition. And what it does, in essence, though, is harm the rest of us. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the most common complaint that you hear about trade. It's about, what about the jobs? Do jobs get eliminated? Does trade with other countries cost jobs? Well, the answer, in a sense, is yes. I grew up in the American Midwest. I watched General Motors and Ford and Chrysler plants close. Friends of mine, family members of mine lost their jobs because of Toyota and Honda, and more recently Hyundai and Kia. BMW, and Mercedes, all of these foreign cars that came into the United States in the 70s and the 80s, they did a number on the American car business, and lots of American jobs in the car industry disappeared. Does trade cost jobs, and therefore do trade restrictions save jobs? In a sense, the answer is yes, but really the answer is no. And the reason is you got to think about it. What happens if I give $1? Well, it's going to cost more than $1. But what if I buy a BMW and I have a bunch of dollars and I hand those dollars to BMW in Germany and they send me a car? Okay, I got a car. They now have these dollars. What do these Germans do with American dollars? Do they wallpaper their offices with the dollars? No, they don't do that. Where are American dollars useful? Mostly in America. So what do Germans who get our dollars, when we buy BMWs, they get a bunch of dollars, what do? They come back to America and say, hey, what do you guys got for sale here? And they buy exports. They buy stuff in America that they want to buy, like pharmaceuticals, which is one of the things we now have an emerging comparative advantage in. They buy our products. They also invest here. They're now making BMWs in South Carolina. They take some of the dollars that we give them to buy BMWs, they take back and they reinvest those dollars in the United States. And what happens when companies invest in the United States? To jobs. It creates jobs. What happens when companies bring money back to buy exports from American firms? It creates jobs. So yes, imports cost jobs in those industries that compete with those imports, but the money that the foreigners get comes back to us and it creates jobs in other industries. So it's not true that jobs are lost when we trade with the rest of the world. Some jobs are lost, but other jobs are gained. And at the end of the day, we're all going to have jobs somewhere as long as we are free to trade. So that's the third part. Yes, there are some arguments against trade, but for the most part, economists think we should favor trade because trade makes us happy and it makes us rich. Thank you.